Okay, thank you for joining me again, Alexander. Today we're going to pick up on our previous conversation, which we had a couple months ago. Now, in that conversation, we began with the question, where are we in history? And you spoke to the transition from industrialism to informationalism, from capitalism to attentionalism. And there are some question marks about where exactly we sit in relation to that paradigmatically. As you've spoken to, these are analyses that we can really only do in hindsight. And so there's a certain openness and liminality to how we situate ourselves today. But nevertheless, there's some powerful framings as we reckon with where we are socially, technologically, politically. We spoke to three concepts in particular to frame the discussion. They were paradigmatics, archetypology, and membranics. We spoke to those at length, and they're all going to be relevant for the conversation today. But so as we don't go over ground we've just recently covered, if we do provide definitions for those, we'll be a little bit on the lighter side. And we also spoke about violence. You've spoken to how the next 50 to 100 years, as you see it in terms of the transition between paradigms, will be particularly chaotic. And there's lots to speak to in there. And in fact, one of the main framings of that conversation was what you spoke to as really the fundamental question for philosophy, which is to do with how to, if I put it in some of my own words, at least mitigate, mediate the potential violence between tribes. And in that context, we spoke about the kinds of forces and pressures which have been destabilizing and disruptive to what you call the sociont, which is something like the, archetypically speaking, ideal tribe, sort of a context of appropriate individuation or dividuation. I think about that as sort of a healthy context of belonging. You could see it as situated at different levels of scale. And of course, in the move to urbanization and now into the era of the internet and mass connectivity, we're dealing with a tremendous exponentialization of connectivity. And so the scale of just how we conceptualize who we are in the sense of our belonging and just what we need to come to terms with about relating with the other in a pluralistic sense is a major question really on the precipice, on the forefront for philosophy. And so we move through a number of different notions and contentions in there. I think in particular, the notion of membranics, understanding the function of membranes was particularly important. Now, as we approach this conversation, there is perhaps just one, maybe two more things to add. First of all, the framing is to do with how can we understand power today, how we can understand power manifesting in the digital age, in the age of attentionalism, in this liminal period between capitalism and attentionalism. And there are some particular notions that you speak to. You first introduce in your earlier work, but you bring up and speak to at length in Digital Libido. And then the same lines of logic are taken on in Process and Event. But you speak to a triadic power relation between the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. And I'm just going to read out a paragraph that you have in the book about those, because it offers a very tight way of just briefly introducing both. And of course, I'll ask you to expand at length. And I think it's important that we consider all these because, as we discussed, as we approach what it is to re-sociontize ourselves, to re-find ourselves in some potential for collaborating in a way that is non-extractive of nature and each other and all the rest of it, we have to reckon with how power is manifesting. And there's lots that I want to sort of really get into here, but the paragraph goes, real power controls the paradigm's most important resources. Imaginary power supervises law and order and carries out the social order's formal exercise of power. It dons the official robes of power and thereby embodies the concept of power in the eyes of most people. Finally, there's symbolic power, which has assumed a monopoly on the historiography of the paradigm and thus even on its truth production, and which therefore formulates, administers, and defends the paradigm's metaphysical values. Feudalist society was governed by the feudalist power triad, which was constituted by the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the clergy. Now, that perhaps is a nice way to begin. If you could speak to what you mean by this triad of power, and then begin with a sense of how you see that being situated in the feudalist context, I think that will give a nice departure point for us to then consider where we are today.
Yeah, exactly. This is why the subtitles were important for me and Jan until we finally forced ourselves to give up on the subtitles. So Process and Event, our sixth book, is the first book that doesn't have a subtitle. But Digital Libido did. Digital Libido, the fifth book, which came out in 2018, has the subtitle Sex, Power, and Violence in the Network Society. And why do we talk about sex, power, and violence? Because sex, power, and violence are constants. They exist in all human societies. Whereas most models for how society operates, for example, in Marxism, you can see a lot of Marxism in our work, but we're also totally redefining and reworking Marxism here. But the Marxist analysis, power analysis, starts with economics. And economics is not a constant. Economics was invented. Economics, as we know it, started probably as everything else in Asia and then traveled to the Middle East and arrived in Europe with Jewish merchants in Venice in the 15th century when the use of coins was industrialized. And eventually was actually through the printing press again. And with the printing press started printing paper money, which actually I think started in Sweden in the 17th century. And that just made the whole carousel of money incredibly efficient, and money became a global phenomenon. So we talk about globalization. Globalization started the same second money became as powerful as it is to us today. But economics, as we know it, is paradigmatic, clearly paradigmatic and not a constant. So economics became the dominant mode of the industrial age. So to really rethink what it means to be human, which is what you and I are really trying to do here, to rethink what it means to be human, like what is the constant and what is the variable in my human identity as I go into the digital and the AI age and the attentionalist age, as we talk about here. This has to be emphasized. Like economics is not a constant, sex, power, and violence are. So what's interesting is to study what happens to sex and power and violence in a digital society compared to the previous industrial age. And we're not being naive about capitalism. We know how terrible it is to be poor. We know how fortunate you are if you're wealthy. We have none of that naivety. Where we agree with the Marxists, with the classical Marxists, is that money became incredibly important for the world, and money flowed across, the channels around the planet, and globalization basically started with economics itself. But I'm a trained economist, so I'm the one who's allowed to slaughter economics and say economics is limited. Economics only goes so far. And there's a certain point beyond which economics is no longer the power game. And power is no longer controlled by having economic power. And we're entering that age now. What's clearly happening in the digital age is that you got so many Elon Musks out there who either have tons of money, can ignore the question of money, more or less, or you can just go to the bank and basically grab a big pile of money for hardly any interest rate at all because the bank so willingly gives it to you just to keep the economy going. So in that case, if you just have an idea and you want to exploit it, you get the money. So we're getting to the point where economics becomes secondary. Remember that, secondary, not dominant. And the word we're now developing for the new book, for the seventh book, a term we've never used before because there wasn't a term for it, is what would the Elon Musks of this world regard as the most important thing in their lives? And then you go back to sex, power, and violence. This is like the power over your own life. and the power to say no to external violence and even execute violence against others if you want to or if you have to, like an employer does with their employees, right? So, or politician does with the voters. So the power structure to be understood for the digital age has to start from the fact that the elite, not the masses, philosophy starts with the elites. The elite are now completely, they're detached from economics, but they're all closely aligned with their own death. That's where you go back to the constant. Sex, power, and violence is all about death. It's all about dying one day. It's all the death is the absolute. Elon Musk knows he's going to die one day. That's why he's breeding like crazy and having babies everywhere with any woman he meets, right? So he uses his money to have tons of babies. And the funny thing with this is that this needs a new term. We call that term chronomics. So chronomics is not an economy of time. Let's not think economy at all. Let's get out of the economics paradigm period. Let's think, what is it like to be the elite, to have the power, to control the violence, to get the sex in a digital society? That's why the book title is Digital Libido. What does it mean to have Elon Musk's dick and Elon Musk's brain and Elon Musk's resources and Elon Musk's power and influence? What does it mean to be like that? And in that case, the weak spot, the Achilles heel for a guy like Elon Musk is the fact that he's still mortal. He's still a mortal human being. This is the constant. Death is the constant. Death is the absolute, as Hegel says. And therefore, we have to restart philosophy from the point of chronomics. And that is definitely a paradigm shift because it means the elite will care about other things. Just like the elite shifted from feudalism, where they cared about owning land, to capitalism, which was having money. Because if you had money, you could buy and you could sell land. The question now is, how can you accumulate so much power that you can have as much money as you need to spend on anything you need to spend the money on if you want to? But at the end of the day, the money is no longer where the power is located. The money is now located in your own damn calendar. And in that sense, all human beings are the same. In that sense, we have 8 billion people with 8 billion private calendars on the planet. And each one is looking into our calendar. And we're then deciding, what are my priorities? What am I going to do with my life until the day I die? What are my priorities tomorrow? What are my priorities next year? How far should I look into the future? And maybe imagine that I'm going to die one day. And will I lie on my deathbed and say to myself, I did what I could do. I did my best with the resources that I had. That is the ultimate power question, the power over yourself. So you see how this is tied together here. This is why we also got asked by Marxists, okay, so you have a shift from the feudalist structure, which you mentioned here, the aristocracy, because they own the land, which is the real power. You have the monarchy, which is the imaginary power. They can execute the violence and they can force you to join the military and go to war. And they're struggling with their aristocracy. And usually one of the aristocrats becomes the monarch, but the monarch is a different institution. And the third one is the truth production. And in this society, that was the monastery. These were the organized religions coming out of the Axial Age. This was Christianity and Islam and their congregations, their churches and their mosques and their synagogues and their sanghas, which were all copies of the Sociant. The reason why churches and mosques work as wonderfully as they do is because you join the congregation just by stepping into the building. You're an equal with everybody else within the congregation. This is the Sociant being replicated. The original nomadic tribe, which we all genetically have inherited inside of us and that we're longing for and that we're looking for all the time, that we want to submit to, that we want to serve, and we want to protect and provide if we're meant for the Sociant. This Sociant in organized religion became the congregation. This is the strength of organized religion. Now, that fell apart with capitalism because capitalism sort of deconstructed the aristocracy and the monarchy and the monasteries and the churches. And what happened was that they were replaced. So the real and the imaginary and the symbolic, which are again constants and timeless, human beings always orientate ourselves in the world through the real and the imaginary and the symbolic. These are the three worlds human beings live in. So the real power now became money itself. Capitalism, capitalists, the bourgeoisie in Karl Marx, the guys who start the factories, own stocks in company, the upper middle classes, as we call them in Western culture. And of course, this is what the United States of America thrived on. It was basically a European colony that went independent, and is still so much the home of capitalism that Americans find it very hard to look beyond capitalism. You and I are sitting here as a Scandinavian and an Australian philosopher, and we see things that Americans just can't see because they're so attached to capitalism because it was their golden age. So they were replaced. So the bourgeoisie were the real power. The imaginary power became the politician, the democratic process, the parliament, the prime minister or the president, if you want to, became, and of course, Donald Trump today is a parody of an old style European monarch, which is really the death of politics as we know it. It's the death of politics, period. I think Donald Trump is there. It's just basically as an ironic statement that politics can no longer create value, can only destroy value. Cannot do anything else. So that's politics. Politics took the role of the monarchy. And the third institution during capitalism became academia. Universities. They took over from the monasteries. So out of the monasteries came the universities that said, no, we're not just going to teach or research theology any longer and try to figure out who God is. Actually, we're going to sort of embarrassingly put theology aside, and they do everything else the philosophy tells us to do, which is create science. First the natural sciences, then the social sciences. And all those sciences were created in a huge academic system that told everybody, we are the truth. And the truth is set by academics. And it's within academics you find the truth. And if you don't have an academic title, you're not allowed to speak because you cannot speak the truth because you're not an academic. It's, of course, a completely circular argument. And that was exactly the point. So we had the dinners. Like Balzac writes in France in the 19th century, you got the new capitalist dinner. You had the bourgeois industrialist who owned the factory. You had the politician who tried to get voted every 4 years, and he was voted out. He became an ambassador somewhere, so he could get voted in again the next time. And then the third category here were the academics, which is like the professor of the university who was the official producer of the official truth and had a monopoly on truth. Now, what happened when the internet arrived? My God, all these three institutions are falling apart. And they're attacking us ferociously. And they're telling us everything that happens online is terrible. And, they should have closed down the internet, but they didn't. They couldn't figure out the internet would kill them all in time because they didn't read Barton Söderqvist 30 years ago, for example. Or any of the other philosophers who said 30 years ago, the internet's going to take over the world. Which is now doing. So we have to redefine the real and the imaginary and the symbolic for the digital age. And John Söderqvist and I are only starting this process with the next generation philosophers like you, Tim. So we can start defining what would really be the real power, what would be the imaginary power, what would be the symbolic power for the digital age. And we have to rethink from the bottom up, all the way down to the very bottom. Because if we think just economics, which, mediocre thinkers do, they think money as if money was eternal and a constant. And therefore they think, well, then money becomes data. And then who controls the data rules the world. And they think they thought brilliantly and they finished thinking. And they called Yuval Harari. And they write things like dataism. And philosophers like us must kill them because they're bad. They're mediocre. They're not really thinking the new paradigm. They're not thinking death. They're not thinking sex. They're not thinking power. They're not thinking violence. They're thinking money. And they're thinking money is replaced by data. That's bad thinking. That's poor thinking. The real shift now is from capital completely to attention. What do I give my attention to? And who deserves my attention the rest of my life? And that's why we use the term attentionalism. And that is a deeply spiritual question. It requires a spiritual exercise. It requires to sit down and ask yourself, who am I and what am I going to do in my life until the day I die? That's why I say that you can't do philosophy anymore without doing spirituality and philosophy together, like you always did in the East. And this is why we have to bring in Eastern wisdom, Eastern thinking, Eastern philosophy, Eastern history to fully and completely understand the rethinking we need to do to define the digital age.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We did speak a little bit to your conception of chronomy in the last podcast, and particular to that was an emphasis on attention, treating attention as sacred, essentially, beginning in the cultivation of one's own capacity to attend well. You spoke to meditation and contemplation, and that's a little bit of what you're pointing to there. It is interesting to me because I know that obviously still data, information, control of data flows is nevertheless part of how you are analyzing power showing up today in digital libido that is connoted with the real. And there's a bit to say there. I mean, examples could obviously be Amazon, and we spoke, and Google and all the rest of them. We spoke into the last podcast. I mentioned the notion of hacking synchronicity, which is basically just pointing to something similar to what Yanis Varoufakis points to in algorithms and data capture so effective that it can predict what you want and train you to teach it more of what you want and get inside your loop of decision making as best it can, so as to treat your attention as something more quantifiable, instrumentalizable, and all of that.
Can you just hear how horrible this sounds?
Of course.
Yeah. Giannis is a mediocre thinker. He still thinks capitalism. And this is why I don't call myself a Marxist anymore, because the true spirit of Karl Marx today is not to stay with the Marxists like Slavoj Žižek, for example, and Giannis. They still think capitalism. They think the shift from money to data automatically follows. Well, data is there. Data is important. But what are the data companies doing that are collecting all our data and processing that data? They try to fuck our brains, and we hate them. So here's the problem. What they don't see is that people today, like you and me, with our laptops and our smartphones and our little lives that we're living within our socions, you in Australia, I mean Scandinavia, you live in a flat white country, as I call Australia. I'm a huge fan of Melbourne. Best lifestyle in the world. But whatever. We're sitting here in our life worlds that we have, and we hear this nonsense. And we're like, well, we know Meta, formerly Facebook, they destroyed the name Facebook so badly they had to rename the company. So they employed thousands of psychologists to turn our children into addicts of their social media. This was the 2010s. And we could just ask our next door neighbor, and they were aware of it too and hated it. And now we're introducing blank bans for kids to not use social media before they're 16 years old and things like that. It's a long dialectical process now where people are taking back the power over their consumption of social media, over their consumption of the smartphone. And we're talking openly about smartphone addiction as being worse than alcoholism. We're doing all those things that human beings actually naturally do in dialectical processes. That's all happening already. So I'm just kind of shocked that the guy like Giannis could talk about these things this way as if this was a given. These guys call this techno-feudalism. Techno-feudalism is already dead and over. Techno-feudalism is Donald Trump. We're laughing at him. We're laughing at the fact that America elected a president who's killing soft power around the world, worth trillions of dollars for the American economy right now. It's the biggest case of self-harm in human history was for Americans to pick Donald Trump as president. But the rest of the world are better off because we have a laugh at it. Now, Europe has to defend itself and Australia has to defend itself. And we have new alliances between Europe and Canada and Australia. And I think Canada should join the European Union before this is over. But, there are all kinds of possibilities if you want to. But we human beings are not stupid. What the old left is thinking is that they think that we human beings would be so stupid so we would buy into the fact that our brains are being fucked by American tech companies. We're not. We're aware of it. We hate it. You and I had this discussion before about American tech companies forcing us into their silos. We had it in private, you and I, that you don't want to buy a product anymore from an American company because the American companies, once I start buying one of their products, they force me to use all their other products and I can't get out of their fucking ecosystem because they got a silo. And they're like, you don't think I'm aware that you're raping me right now because you're American? Capitalism works that way. We're not naive about capitalism. We know that. So when we think data, we should first of all think maybe data is just the extension of capitalism. And maybe the collection of the processing of data as we know it so far is just even more capitalism. And this is still not the new. Maybe the digital age has not yet arrived. Dare the thought. Right? So I think it's much better for us to think much more thoroughly and take Karl Marx seriously. And I read Nietzsche through Marx, like Deleuze and Foucault did, because I think that's much better than stay with the Zizeks of the world who just go back to vulgar old Marxism and think people are stupid. Because I don't think people are stupid at all. I think people are intelligent and they're intuitively intelligent in a way the machine is not. And through our intuition, we get tired of people who misuse our time and destroy our calendars and try to think they can force us to use their products and we don't want to.
Yes, well, I certainly agree with that. Would it be fair to say that as you look at attentionalism, then from the perspective of a more dispassionate analysis, one could look through a more dystopian lens, or one could look through a more, and your term for this would be a protopian lens, right? And let's just put on that side of it a desire to treat attention as sacred, and we could say some more things.
Let's not be naive. Both are correct. It's just that for some people, we talk about an elite and then we talk about the masses. And Jan Söderqvist and I have been adamant in all our 6 books that we firmly believe the digital age, like all new paradigms, will be an intense class society, unfortunately, from the very beginning. If you sort of even out the classes among human beings eventually and try to create some kind of shared abundance and then equality, then that's a long process way into the paradigm. The problem with the new paradigm, it's always created enormous class divisions. So both are probably correct. Let's start with that assumption that both the protopian and the dystopian perspective when it comes to the digital age are correct.
Right. And so from that perspective, then connoting control of data flows can be mapped to the real power, but can be languaged more cynically in that dystopian way. Now, in your earlier work, again, when I first heard you speak about the prospect, really, of algorithms to come, it was a fairly optimistic note. And I think it's fair to say that most people who have experienced effects of algorithms really have experienced them in their dystopian version, even though there's good stuff they bring to music discovery and there's things that can be said. And now with AI, there's a certain amount of power that can be shaped to support social graphing and research. And there's certainly value.
And they're all getting better.
And they're getting better.
And they're all getting better and more adjusted to what we actually want, because otherwise we turn them off.
Well, this is sort of the question, isn't it? Because, I think it's fair to say that most people have experienced more of the dystopian effects of algorithmic intervention in our lives than otherwise. And so when it comes to what power...
Are you sure about that?
Okay.
Isn't it just that we debate that more? Like, for example, if I travel from Stockholm to Melbourne, I'll pick up Google Maps right away, and then I'll start locating myself in Melbourne. I'll figure out which restaurants to go to, which nightclubs to go to. I'll get the tickets if I want to. I get a rental car. I drive down to Geelong, which is even nicer than Melbourne. I do all those things. I wouldn't have done any of those things 30 years ago without the algorithms.
Fair enough. Yeah,
I don't think we realize how much the algorithms are already influencing our lives, and we hardly even pay attention to it. And that's part of a capitalist system and an attentionalist system on top of it. And we don't mind that at all because our lives are easier, more informed. We have to guess a lot less, and we know a lot more. And if you have to guess less and know more, you love it. And we just don't talk about it that much because it takes me being 65 years old to remember what life was like before the internet. And kids don't even know that because they think the smartphone is a body part that always existed. So, so the funny thing is that I think we have a debate on the negative side effects of the algorithms, which is very public true. But I think for the vast majority of people, actually, we don't even realize how great the algorithms actually are and how much they use us. Unfortunately, they also are used by authorities to create a police state, and we're being, covered over, and we have cameras and microphones everywhere. You register everything we do. It's terrible when you come to China. It's almost as bad anywhere else, and that should be debated. So there's definitely dystopian aspect of it as well. True.
Yes. No. Fair enough. I take all that on board, and I do in fact think the same way. So, what am I speaking to? Really, I'm speaking to the shadowed risks of atrophying our own capacity for attunement to the social relations and connections, even to place that may be valuable for us. Now, of course, the world has opened up and it's very important. I love using Google Maps and all the rest of it, but obviously the argument will go regarding atrophy that we can't tell directions as well as we could. And then lots of other elements of our humaning can also atrophy when it comes to us, our relating with each other, and our capacity to think and communicate. And so as an unchecked force, the subtle imposition of algorithmic effectiveness to move us and feed our desire with that which might give us something we think we need or desire in the short term, but is actually disconnecting us, atrophying us, and slowly eroding our capacity to be accountable to our contexts, projects, as thinking, creating beings.
Our socions.
This is where the sort of the negative aspects of it come in. I just want to emphasize those while also recognizing that there is like a right relationship to come into here, and that's important.
I can give you a perfect example of what you just described here, Tim. We heard the term somewheres and anywheres.
Right.
So somewheres are people who are attached to a specific place, geographically speaking, and anywheres are like they can move around. And the term came up, I don't remember who came up with this, like 30 years ago or something. It was a smart British guy who came up with those two terms, somewheres and anywheres, as a first definition of what would be helpful for you to become a netocrat. So what would be helpful for you to be a winner in the digital age? What's easier for you? Well, if you're not attached to a specific geographical position, you can move around a lot. Certainly nomadism comes back, and it's called digital nomadism today, meaning that wherever my laptop is, that's my home. And you realize that wherever my laptop is, that's my home. If you can work from anywhere in the world, and you have a relationship towards your employer, for example, so you're allowed to work from anywhere else, anywhere you like in the world because you're that good or whatever, then all of a sudden you have much more freedom to move. And because you have more freedom to move, your social network will be much more global and much more successful, etc. So there's so many good side effects that comes out of not being attached to a specific position. But I would say, and John and I have sort of extended that concept to 3. So we go from from somewhere to anywhere to everywhere. And everywhere is when you're so detached from geographical position that the world itself is the geographical position. Meaning that that space just disappeared. As long as you stay on planet Earth. Space, that's probably why Elon Musk wants to go to outer space, because he still likes space, because space just disappeared on this planet. With Starlink itself, space has disappeared. You and I can sit right now in Sweden and Australia and create antipodean philosophy in real time. That's exactly what we're doing. So just an advice to people is that you are allowed to be absolutely attached to a specific geographical place and be Heideggerian. You're allowed to. You better turn it into an advantage if you are. So, for example, why don't you become a Melbourne flat white coffee influencer or something like that? If you live in Melbourne, why don't you become Mr. Melbourne? I am Melbourne. Anybody goes to Melbourne must consult me. I know every little detail there is to know about Melbourne. I'll be your personal guide. Besides sitting on Melbourne AI and knowing everything an AI can know about Melbourne, I will also be personify Melbourne. So call me and I will charge you for giving you Melbourne. So if you're going to stay in a place like Heideggerian, the thing to do is to be truly attached. Do you see how this is chronomic, all this thinking? What am I going to spend my time on? What am I going to prioritize? And what I'm looking at here is your archetype. If your archetype goes towards, I am the one who really believes in locale, who really believes in geographical position, then play that card really hard. If you're an anywhere, then you probably have an address somewhere in the world. You move around a bit, but you have a home somewhere. You might even have a family when you have that home. But you're free to travel. You enjoy traveling. It extends your life quality. It may even extends your professional career. You might be better at what you do professionally because you travel more, etc. So then you become an anywhere. But you could go all the way, which is a historically new phenomenon for the digital age paradigm, that to be an everywhere. That means just saying, I've accepted the fact that everything happens in real time, online, and geography has disappeared because light travels at 7.5 loops around the planet per second. So I might as well live in Iceland, talk to somebody in New Zealand, and we don't even ask ourselves, why are you sitting in Melbourne? Why am I sitting in Stockholm? Because it's completely irrelevant. What's interesting is the meeting between Tim and Alexander, and what's interesting is the philosophical discussion. So we take Zoom, and suddenly we're everywhere. So I think this is the way to present the alternatives to people humbly and say, we now live in a world where chronomics is the new art. Not economics, chronomics is what you do with your time, which is important. And here I think is the shift where we are indeed going from capital to data, because data eats capital, the same with the capital ones ate land. And if capital ate land ownership, you could use capital to buy or sell land, then capital beat land. You can do that with data now because all capital is becoming data. We're getting rid of the coins and the paper money, and it's all becoming data anyway. And we have Bitcoin or whatever. We have all these different currencies and things, and they're all now data, and bank accounts are data, and everything is data. And you can look into my eye with a little machine, and then you can take money from my bank account when I pay you for a chewing gum. So we're doing all those things already. That's flawless. It's already happening. Data is eating capital. But data is only the end game for capitalism. The game we're now playing, which is why we need to go spiritual, is the game of time itself. Not data, time. Literally time. What are you wasting your time on? Because if space has become redundant, if space has disappeared, if everything in the world is happening in an everywhere sense, to be honest, if the new elite practice everywhere as their state of mind, I'm everywhere on this planet at once because I can be present with anybody on the planet, wherever they're located at any given time. Because we now have media that have destroyed space and eliminated space from the equation. That means the only thing I've got left before I die is time. So it's really a shift from money to time. Therefore, it's a shift from economics to chronomics. And this was not obvious to me and Jan when we wrote about data in the past. It's rather when the Yuval Harals of the world got started about dataism that I got irritated, because it's just like, wait a second, data can be copied, money cannot. If I copy money, it's no money, it's illusory value. Every little discrete unit of money is unique, whereas every discrete unit of data can be copied. So data works completely differently than money does. So already there, we should be alarmed that data is not what's going on. And whoever controls the data is not going to rule the world. It's only going to be the real power at the bottom, because time itself is not the category we base the real power on. We base the real bottom on data. It is a data-fixated world. AI uses data. Ada processes data. The processing of the data gets better and better, and the collection of the data gets better and better, and that's why AI improves all the time. That's correct. The real power is always how we recycle the past in the best possible way. And there's no better way of recycling the past than to get the data of the past. And they recycle and process that data and create value out of doing that. But when I pay an American tech company to not have to see an ad, I have already moved towards reversed capitalism. I pay to not be part of the capitalist system. I work hard within the capitalist system to make enough money so that I can pay to not be a part of it. That is the arrival of attentionalism. And the Yuval Hararis and the Slavoj Žižeks of this world don't see this. They're too mediocre to see it. This means attention takes over from capital. It's not replacing capital. Data replaces capital. What ultimately killed both capital and data is the attention I give to things the rest of my life. And that is a deeply human question. This is why Jan and I are telling everybody our 7th book, no matter how long it takes to write it, it's going to be called Life as a Work of Art. And we're going to skip the machine entirely and only talk about human beings in the new book. We're ready to be humanists. We're ready to be existentialists in the whole new way required for the digital age with guys like you, Tim.
Okay. All right. I'm going to try and say some things here with one eye on clarifying where I think some listeners may be in wanting to really understand what we've spoken to so far. I also want to share a couple things which I, over the course of this conversation or other conversations, would need to wrestle with a bit, while also acknowledging, first of all, that I think your point around time and what we do with time is a fundamental point. Yep. So I accept that, and thinking that in the context of where power really lies is important. I somewhat think that, space is going to bite back quite significantly. And if I look at what is happening in the world, I think if everywhere is more or less fucked, then space has still quite a lot to say, right? And I also appreciate as well, and I reckon with this very deeply, the cultivation of relationship with the natural world and the attunement to where we and how we receive signal as such, as being something which can operate in a very deep way in that everywhere sense when we communicate with each other around the world. I certainly desire to develop that as a really high art and craft, philosophy in that broadly communicational sense. I'm a big defender of that. And I think people miss just how embodied actually that activity is to truly do it well. However, I also think it is best supported and is necessarily embedded in a fuller conception of ecology as such. And I do think that, and so I know you agree, you're going to agree with that.
I knew right away the 3 E's: ecology, environment, and sorry about that. Go on. Embodiment. Ecology, I think the 3 E's. We can develop a Bard-Adelin hypothesis here. So we're dealing with the return of space. It's marginal, but it's happening, and their ecology and their embodiment and their environment. We have those 3 E's, right? We can work with those 3 E's, for example.
Okay, so we can.
And they're all spatial categories. That's the point. They're all spatial categories.
Yes. Well, let's sort of bench that for a bit, because I want to keep people who are feeling the importance of space with us, and I think it's more than relevant. Now, the other thing that I wanted to clarify is that we've been speaking to the notion of real power here quite a lot, and I know that these notions, real, imaginary, and symbolic, you take from Lacan's work, and it has been the case, I think, in really conceptualizing how we think about capital and then data today, to really get a proper contextual sense of that and to think about how we utilize our attention. We've already been drawing on the influence and the interdependence, really, of the symbolic and the imaginary registers of the triad as well. And so for people who are, there's something to persist with this. So on that, I kind of want to ask you to speak to how you see the symbolic and the imaginary also show up today, and with historical analogies as well, I think are helpful. If I can just sort of offer how I think it's already implied in this conversation that if we're treating attention and calendars and time well, then a big part of that is to do with having the vision to actually take a view on life as a work of art, and to actually have the discernment about what to do with one's time. Now, that arguably can be seen through, at the level of power and that triad, a symbolic function. And there you'll often speak about, protopianism, and previously, obviously, the clergy and academia. And so at the level of interpreting, at the level of making sense, in a sense, of what is worth doing, so as to not fall prey to what is already functioning in a more dystopian way, as sort of data influencing what is coming into your field of awareness, how to actually not only recognize that, but to envision otherwise, is borrowing from a different register of power on this view. And then to speak to the imaginary element, where previously you might have had the monarchy and then the politicians. I liked how in the last conversation you spoke to the politicians as leaning into manipulation, whereas finance corrupts, politics manipulates, and academia has fallen to conformation. You spoke to that. In the case of imaginary power showing up today, how we designate membranes around who we interact with or stay in communication with. You speak about the curator, or also sometimes the sensocrat, as belonging to this register. And so there are some elements here that are quite important to fold into even thinking about data and how we relate to it as human beings, without which I think, it's not fully contextualized in terms of where you're actually speaking from. So would you like to clarify anything in there now I've spoken for a bit?
Yeah, excellent. The title, Process and Event, we can go back to there, because the event is on the symbolic side and the process is on the imaginary side. And that's why, for example, Graham Harman's new book is called Waves and Stones. I mean, he's rewriting our work. Process and Event is his own work, and he talks about the waves, processes, and stones, events. So we come back to the difference between continuity and discretion. Any kid knows that if you have a little square and you have a little circle, it's so fucking funny because you can never unite the two. The square doesn't go into the circle doesn't go into the square, and it's hilariously funny. And mathematics is built on this contradiction. All of dialectics actually is built on the contradiction between the square and the circle in a fundamental sense. So the imaginary power here is the continuity, and the symbolic power is discrete. Great. Then data is completely symbolic. So what data does is that it perfects symbolic power. Then you can locate, okay, if data is the real power, it then moves to the symbolic. And it moves to symbolic, it becomes data processing. So if I collect the data, if I have more data than you have, I have the real power. If I then process the data better than you process the data with the tools that I use and then start applying that, I moved on to symbolic power. That means they will all go to the AI to have an update on the most correct and balanced view of the world, meaning of the past. Because data is always data from the past. Data says nothing about the future. And that's exactly why I have this beautiful English word called imagination. And we imagine something. We imagine it in the future, or at least at a different location than where we are. But it's usually in the future. So we imagine the future. We call it the virtual in philosophy. The virtual of the future. It's like, imagine anything. Imagine whatever you like. Imagine a totally different life than the one we live today. You can imagine anything you like and then project it onto the future. And that is imagination. And this is why the imaginary power ends up as the temporary solution to the struggle between the symbolic and the real power. So we can say, for example, that if you have an aristocracy here that owns the land, and you have the churches here, and they're basically preaching you must bow to the aristocracy, and you must follow the aristocracy, and you must work hard for the aristocracy 6 days a week. On the seventh day, you come to the church and we give you life after death, and then you're ours. And to keep that settlement between the church and the aristocracy, you need a fucking monarchy in between. So basically, imaginary power also takes over because it is the future-oriented power. It basically takes over where you have a deadlock. So we always cover over the deadlock between the symbolic and the real with imaginary. This is fundamental to Jacques Lacan, for example, in psychoanalysis. This is how the sense of self is created. It's created as the covering over of a deadlock, which is then given a name. So you put a name on the deadlock, and that is Tim and Alexander and our subjectivities. So I hope that makes sense too. So when we look towards the future, when we sort of we can start imagining something I haven't even written about yet. So you inspire me here in this conversation. We can imagine an imaginary chronomics, and we can imagine a symbolic chronomics. And the symbolic chronomics is basically, what should I spend my time on according to the data? What is the smartest way for me to spend my time to maximize a certain output, for example, my bank account or something like that? That would be like doing symbolic chronomics. And then you could do imaginary chronomics. Okay, I've got time off. I don't need to work. What am I going to do with my spare time? Who do I want to engage with? What should I leave behind? And what should I proceed towards in the future? Those decisions, when I make those more existential decisions, I go to the imaginary. So this is why we have the imaginary and the symbolic. All human beings do. We separate the world. Ever since text came into our world, like Jacques Derrida writes, ever since text came into the world, the symbolic came in with enormous power, and it's exclusively human. Only humans have language, and only humans have text. But we created a world out of text. For example, as a writer, when you write a novel, you create a symbolic universe. And then you have the imaginary. For example, if I'm a painter and I make a painting and it's dissociative and it can be interpreted in so many different ways or whatever, then I'll go towards the imaginary. So human beings, we love jumping between the imaginary and symbolic. And in a very, very, very rudimentary sense. Usually you place the masculine or the young onto the symbolic, and you place the imaginary and the yin onto the female, on the feminine. Of course, this is very rudimentary in the sense that most men and women obviously jump between the two poles. But in a fundamental sense, if you're going to put yin and yang onto them, this is what you would have to do. So I hope this makes sense. We'll make the split between the imaginary and the symbolic. The difficulty, philosophically speaking, is that this changes slightly when you add the real and it becomes a triad. The positions aren't that fixed. You know, in philosophy, what you do, you don't work in mathematics. You work in themes. You work with relations all the time. So if I make a relation between the imaginary and the symbolic, and I try to define them, it looks pretty fixed, right? And then I just think that I'm going to add the real, and then the other two positions are going to be the same. No, they start changing too, because the relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic also is affected by the relationship between the imaginary and the real, and the symbolic and the real. This makes it fiendishly difficult to do these things. And this is why we are telling everybody, Jan and I, that this is a work in progress. It would have been the easiest thing in the world in our first book 25 years ago to define instantly and say that, okay, so this is going to be the new digital triad. This is going to be the new power structure. We only basically said the data is going to be part of the mix. Eventually, now we're shifting towards maybe data is just the extension of capitalism. Maybe actually it's time itself, simply because space is redundant or marginal from now on. Maybe that shift already happened in philosophy. The shift from Kant to Hegel in the early 19th century was the shift from a philosophy of space to a philosophy of time. And in this sense, Hegel was incredibly prophetic And this is why the Hegelian turn in philosophy resulted in Darwin, in Freud, in Nietzsche, in all these amazing 19th century thinkers who all thought time and lifespan rather than space. And out of that came existentialism. What am I doing with my time? Not where am I located? And then Heidegger tried to put the location back into the picture in the early 20th century, and he sort of failed. he was a Nazi too, so that's a bad camp to be in. But anyway, it's interesting to see how the new triad is slowly, gradually developing and needs to be fine-tuned and redefined. So we do have a technocracy, or whatever you want to call it. We call it let's just call it a data netocracy. First netocracy clearly is there. There's huge tech companies, even if they're finishing off capitalism at the moment, they're trying to find other models for the capitalist aspect of what they're doing to make more profits or whatever they're up to. They're there. They're undeniably there. And Elon Musk is a netocrat, and Sergey Brin and Larry Page are netocrats. That's clearly, since 2005, how we define the term. But there are two other types of netocrats, and we call these Sensocrats and Protopians. And that's just work in progress. Let's see where that takes us. Why we say Sensocrats and Sensocracy is because we talk about senses and sensors. And we're clearly moving towards a world where we go back to space, we go back to ecology and environment and embodiment. We're finding sensors everywhere, and the body has senses. And the senses are embodied. We have senses and they're embodied. So the relationship between the senses and the sensors everywhere now in society, with cameras, microphones, and data flows being created, and where we're moving and where we're going, and what we like and what we don't like. I mean, I don't have to ask you what you thought of a restaurant anymore. I can just look at your behavior at the restaurant from the data flow that comes out of the restaurant, and I know whether you loved it or whether you hated it. Because human behavior is more sincere than any reply on any survey could ever be. Surveys are over and done with. I don't need them anymore. I just need data on your actual physical embodied behavior. And that creates an enormous power and a power structure, which we're making a bet here. We're making a bet that this is going to kill politics. And we now start thinking that at least in the interval, we will elect politicians who look funny and we feel good with, who have an AI with them. We're going to ask every politician before we vote with them, what kind of AI are you basing your policies on? Because otherwise, we might as well vote for the AI, because the AI is going to bet on the politician. So that's a sensocracy. The term for that is a sensocracy. If we start thinking already now that, why don't we ask the AI in our community, which is the best practice for a community like ours, of our size, with our budget, what is the best practice in the world to do, for example, running schools for 7 to 12-year-olds? Which is the best model in the world for doing that for kids? We can ask AI that already today and get a really good answer. And that answer is going to get better and better. And then it's only a question of time before we say, why do we even pick politicians? Why don't we just get a really good AI and then improve on that AI and let that AI run our community? That's the death of politics, right? Good. Then you might as well think, what would be the death of academia? Hence my work with Michael Gibson and the guys at the Peter Thiel Foundation, because their product is brilliant. It says that, okay, if you got a college kid anywhere in the world today, you might as well be, prior to the venture capitalists, and pick out the kids who are 18 years old who are going to do the big startups to make billions of dollars for you. And you're going to hire them already when they're 18 and said, you can't go to Harvard because it's a waste of time. We're going to give Harvard to Ethiopian peasants. So the kids in the Ethiopian countryside can go to Harvard while staying in the Ethiopian countryside. We're going to use AI to do that. We're gonna empower people to that extent. That is the real AI revolution. That also means the death of Harvard for the people who used to go to Harvard, the power brokers. Because why would they need academia for when they have AI all the time, everywhere in their pocket, accessible for the rest of humanity's history? Doesn't make any sense. So we call that protopianism, because what AI does is that AI is constructed to be protopian. It's constructed to do incremental improvements of processes at all times by adding more data and reprocess the data it already has to improve and improve and improve and improve and improve and get better and better and better at doing the tasks we're asking the AI to do, based on nothing but historical data and the processing of historical data. Meaning the AI will use probabilities where you, as a human being, will use your intuition. And intuition is going to beat probabilities with a wide margin, meaning you still have a role as a human. Your intuitive self is something the machine can never be.
Yes. Well, on that final point, I certainly agree. I think,
I mean, Tim, I'm not spoiled to having these discussions with people who actually get concepts like Sensocracy and Protopianism and dug into our philosophy this far, because this is exactly why I can also be humble with you in this conversation. And I owe it to tell you and the people who are watching this conversation, the humility I feel here is one of somebody who's really done the work and who's a co-philosopher when it comes to these things. And please remember, Jan Söderqvist and I made this one promise to each other and our readers when we started doing philosophy almost 30 years ago. We will never, ever try to change another human being. Never. We firmly believe our readers are reading to get better informed and to go into dialogue with us to themselves transform themselves in whatever way they like. I've never, ever had the desire to change another human being. All my work is simply descriptive philosophy, not prescriptive. I'm not telling you what you should do at all. I'm telling you how things work so you can orientate yourself better in the landscape we have ahead of us. That's all I'm doing.
yes,
In
well,
this sense, I'm
certainly.
deeply Nietzschean. Nietzsche wanted to define the conditions for being a noble, solitary person to make decisions for yourself. Existentialism started with Nietzsche, properly. And what Nietzsche did to kill Kierkegaard, who was still a Christian, and to go beyond Christianity, to move towards the stage we're in now, what Nietzsche did was exactly this. He talked about transformation as a process of the self, but he never told you how to be transformed, because then you wouldn't be a self. You would just be a slave to him.
Yeah.
So this, I think it's important at this stage to say that we're working simply with maps and descriptions.
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting clarification. And you've also said in this conversation as well that a good part of this is an ongoing work of thinking. And so these aren't, in all cases, complete maps. And yeah, so there were a couple threads which I wanted to relate to there. See if they can.
Well, we can go back to the return to space to begin with, because we have the three E's: ecology and environment and embodiment, that I'm interested in. And how you see those in a world where we, at the same time, ever since the telegraph arrived, remember Marshall McLuhan is a philosopher in Insight. Ever since the telegraph arrived, we were shocked that something that happened in New York could be transferred as data to London within seconds. And it didn't take months on boats any longer to find out what's going on in the rest of the world. I mean, if you were in Australia and I was in Sweden 200 years ago, it would take us a year or so to even figure out what happened a year ago in Melbourne or Stockholm. And now we're sitting here literally having real-time conversations. And that revolution is enormous. That is what I mean with we have killed space. Like,
Okay.
we killed
So
God. We didn't know what we were doing. We killed space. This is what I mean. But it doesn't mean space has disappeared any more than capitalism has disappeared, because we're still embodied. We still need an ecology. We talk about ecologies all the time, like context we're located in, and the environment. We have the climate issue, for example. I mean, if the planet becomes a place where human life can no longer even exist, then we've destroyed it. And then this human being who went from space to time 100% has also been destroyed.
yes. Okay. So yeah, one of the threads is definitely space. The other one is can be pointed to in the phrase the tyranny of the past. I'm using that as just a placeholder for improper usage of AI. And you've spoken to this a little bit. I mean, obviously that.
Yeah, it's very simple. If you ask the AI how to run society, it would create a caste society instantly. It would, because it would say, well, I only know the past, and therefore I will recycle the past. And if you're forced to recycle the past and deny that there's even a future of possibilities, that there's any freedom of the future, then you end up with a caste system. So this is exactly what we need to break. We need to know what AI can do, it cannot do, and get to the point where it cannot do certain things. And for example, that's where art is located. AI creates slop. Human beings create art. We have these distinctions already, and there clearly are these differences that are incredibly interesting.
Yes, and so there's quite a few things to say there. One other thing, there's quite a few that AI can't do, is be accountable. That's partly linked to the fact that it doesn't care, right? And I wonder about the connection actually between accountability and space, because in a sense we are bound, as the substrate that we are bound to this earth in so many ways. And maybe in the future, maybe there's part of, who knows? Physics is somewhat of an open book to me anyway. It takes us, in a slightly different direction. But our accountability to space, and we have a relationship with history that's living. We're always ongoing in our interpretation of it, and we have a stake in that. Whereas AI is, again, always just mimicking and recycling valuations as weights, as ones and zeros that can be toggled and programmed, that are discrete and not continuous as an evolving process of care, the kind of care that, in a sense, like, is involved in the kind of presence that participates in transformation. To introduce another couple concepts, you speak to the sublime, right? But that can participate in a relationship with mystery. So we can care for and be accountable to that which is beyond us and that which we don't necessarily understand. But then with intuition, or other words like this, right, we can attune in some values oriented way in terms of what we want to shape or give ourselves to as a project to create, without imposing on it from above what it should be in advance. And AI is always limited with respect to that. Now it can make tests, and it's
only recycling the past and cannot do anything else.
Exactly. Right. So there's that as an angle that I'm speaking to. That I want to keep that with us, and then just say a couple of basic things about the space element, just so they're on the table, because I can imagine you folding them in. And that's just to notice the obvious things regarding how AI plus drone technology are massively altering the balance of power. And in terms of the return of space, you only need to look at the Strait of Hormuz and the capacity to shut down so much of the material aspects of globalization in the world, which will have a tremendous effect on resource flows and the health of populations and famine and all the rest of it. And so you'll have obviously mass attempts at immigration, and that's going to make a whole bunch of places really unstable and not good places to tap into the internet to.
Especially as politics is collapsing.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah,
right.
That's what I say. The next 50 to 100 years are going to be chaotic and anarchic, in a fundamental sense, because there used to be institutions, at least, that kept the whole world system together, so we could globalize the world decently. But that's all falling apart now because politics is going absolutely mad. It's become mad theater, the whole thing. So that is incredibly dangerous. Nuclear proliferation is already happening. So yes, to all these things. This is what's so dangerous right now. I'd like to go back to why we're doing a philosophy of time more radically even than Hegel, and what we mean with sort of space being secondary. Space is still there. I give you a perfect example of when space starts to play a role. We as philosophers think about hypertime, and physicists even think about a separate category called subphysics, where they think about time without space, because if time is primordial and space is a secondary category to time. We even think physics that way these days, by the way. All physicists do. Then if you do physics that way, you have to think hypertime. But for human beings, this makes no sense at all because we live in space-time. We're spatio-temporal creatures. And philosophers work with human beings. We do social philosophy here. We do existentialist philosophy, you and I. I mean, you're a real existentialist if anybody, Tim. So what we're doing here is we're going back to time philosophy for human beings. Here's the trick when you start looking at the relationship between us and AI. It becomes obvious that the AI is stuck in the past and recycles the past and takes whatever data we fed it about the past. It's not really recycling the past. It's recycling the data about the past that we fed it. It's recycling data. It's not recycling the past, but it's recycling data about a certain worldview of the past, which is in itself a worldview from the past, meaning it reflects the power structure and the worldview of those who collected the data and put the data inside the AI. And that's the power structure it's recycling. That's why it has an intense sense of nostalgia and history, recycling, returning, but nothing novel going on. All it can do is to create novel combinations of the past, which is kind of mundane and quite simple. And that's exactly why slop has this character. So you write a Beatles song with AI, and it sounds almost like the Beatles, and it's scary. And you listen to it, and then you realize it sounds like the Beatles are in a retirement home and 95 years old and demented when they wrote the song, because it's not as good as yesterday was. That's always what happens with slop all the time. And that is it. That is a limit of AI, which is built into the AI itself because it's only built on recycling data from the past. Okay. That means it's completely deterministic. Wait a second. Doesn't it use probabilities? Wait a second. Probabilities are deterministic because probabilities are still based on patterns from the past. They just make certain outcomes of those patterns probable rather than definite. And that's, of course, how the AI covers over the fact that it doesn't have any data from the future. We human beings create the future. We are supposed to embrace the future in Nietzsche. What we do is that we scarcely discover we have absolute freedom looking into the future. But here is where it gets really interesting, and philosophers have been sloppy. They have often mistaken the virtual for the potential. The virtual is the category into the far future, and it has no space. Because you can get to anywhere you want if you have infinite future, and therefore space is redundant. But the potential requires space, because with the collapse of the virtual into the potential, space is what gives potency to time, meaning I can act. And then I'm located in Stockholm. You might be in Melbourne. We're only in Stockholm and Melbourne, you and I, and only you are in Melbourne, only I am in Stockholm, and we're located, suddenly the space shrinks to a specific point in space where the location occurs, and I can only do what I can do there. I give you a perfect example. I here have a copy of brilliant Swedish coffee with some oat milk in it. Okay, so I'm going to have a sip of this coffee. You cannot drink this coffee with me right now because you're not in Stockholm. This space, when time moves from hypertime, which is virtual, to space-time, which is potential, the space is what adds potency to time. It's because I am located in a specific location, even if it's with my laptop. That laptop is still located somewhere. It is space that adds potency and enables me to act. But I will act from an imagination about the future that I feel is sort of a direction towards where I'm going. Meaning I'm going to stay up for the next 4 hours. I can drink coffee because there's caffeine in it. So I already am imagining a certain future, at least for the next 4 hours, which the coffee will have an effect on. So I make those decisions all the time. AI can't do any of that. AI is never in the future. AI is not even in the present. AI is just an assistant where we go to check a reasonably reliable version of the past that we can subscribe to. Reasonably reliable version of the past. Better than wild guessing would be. And this is why it's such a strong logos. It has no pathos. There's no emotions attached to AI. And therefore there's no mythos, because the mythos is in the present. So the pathos, we can place the pathos in the future. Our feelings are always directed towards the future. Then we can go to the mythos, the myth we're creating about who we are in the world we're living in. And that myth is what we do with the present state. We don't know everything at the present state. We know we don't know everything at the present state. We actually enjoy not knowing everything when we are at the present state. We create a myth about Tim, about Alexander, about philosophy, about our friends and, people we love and the world we live in, etc. We create that myth in the present state. The past is where facts are located. We call them factualities because they're actualities and they're facts at the same time. The factualities about the world we live in is all the past, because the past we can't do anything about. This is what Hegel means with that for a human being, the past will always look determinist, but the future will always look indeterminist. And that is the correct way of looking at determinism and determinism. They're not opposed. It's the future and the past that are opposed to each other. And as human beings, we can imagine a different future than the world we live in today. And that imagination is exactly what keeps us going. And in Hegel, it's actually called absolute freedom. But the absolute freedom is virtual. It's way into the past. The actual freedom, where I make decisions, or the potential freedom, where the potency lies, I should say, that is the present state. And that's where I make my decision. That's where space returns with a vengeance to time.
Yes. Okay. So there's probably in a later conversation, I'd like to speak more to the metaphysics of that and bring in some other angles. So there's definitely an avenue there. Just in terms of where we're at with some other threads of the conversation and recognizing how power is showing up today, I want to say something basic about space and the effectiveness of AI to make proximal enough prediction, induction as to where things are in space, whether it's Google Maps or this is the location of a desalination plant that I can hit with a drone and totally change what's possible to live in as an ecology, right, in a part of the world. And so to point out the ways in which so much, not only of our civilization, but also of our actual bodies, is limited in space and moves at paces over durations which are, they're constrained by our biology, and they're often running on technologies that have come about in previous paradigms, and so can be destroyed very, very easily and cheaply by this new power that has emerged. And so in that regard, obviously, artificial intelligence in combination with human intent to deploy is a massive, complex ingredient. It adds a tremendous complexity that can't be predicted unless one wants to point to we're going to enter chaos as a result. So that's maybe a basic point there. But I want to bring in, and this is somewhat adjacent really, but there's a question in here around how you are seeing, whether you want to call them netocratic structures. This is kind of a question for me, because we could point to, okay, Elon Musk plus paying for this influencer over here and maybe buying a network.
No. The influencers are capitalism, pure capitalism. They're not part of the digital age. They go.
And yet, of course, to influence previous elections, influencers have been massive. And, and to the degree that budgets and trigger buttons of where to deploy AI for a military purpose has any relevance today at all, which it still does to some degree, and it can have these disproportionate effects, we're obviously still within the total mess of a whole bunch of power, which can utterly, destroy the leisure requirement of thinking more holistically about where life and the world could go, right? So yes, I don't mean to say influencers that is attentionalism, but, the early signs of how attention as a quantity, right, is clustering. There's an awful lot of gamed out rubbish that's tremendously effective at gaining an awful lot of attention and orienting the educational context of kids. I mean, so Mr. Beast is an extremely good example. It's really relevant to listen to Mr. Beast in his first Joe Rogan podcast, just go through everything he's learned about how to game the algorithm is extremely instructive. I mean, this is someone who's evidenced the capacity to know exactly what to do for that purpose. And as a result, right, he's able to sell chocolate to kids and do whatever he wants. Now, okay, so I still think it's important to grapple with how the momentum for social movements and organizations of people at an elite level who are also wanting to remain in a power over relationship with respect to the broader population are actually attempting to coordinate today. And in their attempts to coordinate today, even if they're not taking on board everything you're saying philosophically about how to orient at a deeper level, are still obviously capable of utilizing emerging powers of digital technology and artificial intelligence to have outsized effects, which are changing the complex environment that philosophy has to take into account. And so it becomes a question of pragmatism with respect to how we relate to this at a process level, which is also something you speak about. You do emphasize as well the importance of approaching this pragmatically with a process framing. And that's what I'm wanting to kind of draw you back into a little bit, because, and this is where my dialogues go often with a lot of people, is this is where it starts to really get into the weeds of, in a sense, what ideas are dominant now. So where like the zeitgeist of interpretation is, as well as, I suppose, as well as where there are openings to actually participate in the transformation and building of understanding.
Okay. Yeah. I think what the problem is that almost everything, I'm not closing the door completely, but almost everything you're looking at out there right now in the news feeds is reactionary. It's just reacting, and it's using the old paradigm or two older paradigms. I mean, Islamism is the reason why we slaughter Islamism in our books is because it's like using a 12th century model to try to apply it on the 20th century, which is even worse than using a 20th century model. So almost everything is reactionary. The netocrats are focusing on creating things like Starlink and Palantir. What they're already doing is that they're basically doing private enterprises that are going to kill government and things like that. Or private enterprises that are going to kill the military and take over the military. Because at the end of the day, the membranics is still there. The territory is still there. Space is still there. To control space, to control the territory, to make people feel safe within the membrane, that we don't have crime in our neighborhood. Either we created a country that doesn't have crime, like Switzerland, or we created a gated community. And we guarantee there's no crime or anything violent going on inside this community. You can walk with your kids to school every day, whatever. And therefore you have to pay to be part of this community, or you have to be selected to be part of this community, which is even more netocratic. So we see these. John and I have written about gated communities for 30 years and said they're going to explode across the planet and be everywhere because of all the school shootings and everything else going on out there. When the gun lobby took over Washington, D.C., it killed American politics. And nobody can now offend the gun lobby anymore because they have the same power in America that the mullahs have in Iran. So America is a gun lobby dictatorship. So when that has happened, you want to have that gated community if you're going to live in America. So people are already going inside their membranes, and they want their membranes to be thick and hard, almost like walls, to protect them from all the threats in the outside world. And
Yes.
Therefore, we're going to look for authoritarian leaders. We need to read Oswald Spengler these days. Ted Mithieu is brilliant. Nick Land is okay, but Ted Mithieu is even better than your fellow Australian Ted Mithieu. It's even better than Nick Land. But these guys are understanding exactly where things are going, in the sense that they go back to the timeless aspect of human beings being afraid of the threats out there in the world. So they want the sociant to be recreated within a firm membrane where they feel protected.
Yes.
And that's exactly why we can put the cameras and the microphones everywhere in cities like Sydney and Melbourne and London and Stockholm, and people are not offended over being covered all the time, because we expect that to happen because we feel so threatened. So that's all of these moments are reactionary.
Yes.
You're
If
not
I may,
seeing
Alexander,
you're
just
not
to jump
seeing
in
any
here.
sort of, you're not seeing any sort of, you're not seeing any sort of netocracy wisdom appearing yet anywhere, I'd say.
Yes. No, I agree with that. The reason I want to jump in is because as you're speaking to this dynamic of gated communities, and obviously I'm not for the netocracy of Palantir and how they look at gated communities, right? But if we take gated communities and recognizing sort of chaos and authoritarianism occurring on the outside, people wanting to protect themselves, I think one thing that's fair to notice is there is a lot of manipulation of reactionary tendencies in people. And so we might say it's reactionary dynamics to attempt to politically modulate populist forces, but people are taking the decision, they're being agentic in their maneuvering of reactive dynamics. And what I want to ask you is to speak a little bit to, so in one of your books, you speak about netocratic swarms and consumptarian mobs. Now, that is going to be obviously more lingo for people, but it's important, I think.
This is why we write about Burning Man and participatory
Yes,
culture.
let me ask the question. Let me just ask the question here, just to put. So, what I'm particularly interested in you speaking to, and you've spoken to the Burning Man elements before and all the rest of it, but what I'm particularly interested in you speaking to is the dynamics of how you see masses of people, and you refer to sort of an underclass, right? But in terms of the consumptariat, but just taking populism, taking the political situation where people are engaged in reactionary identity struggles rather than engaging, in communication or collaboratively working together to try and they're not in touch with what is it to actually build a future together. I would like you to speak to what you see as the forces. And you speak to this with terms again that are going to be terms people haven't referred to, like the anoject and these sorts of things. So, but there are dynamics that you name in terms of how mobs, how different kinds of populist mob come together and can be manipulated. And why I'm interested in you speaking to that is because I'm very attuned to the resonance, the affectivity, and the openness of communication, an actual real relating that can take place, which cannot take place in those contexts. And one of the elements of voicecraft and the elements of my work is to attempt to understand and to embody and to actually do the work of creating contexts where just a little bit bridges can be made across what would otherwise be gated contexts to open up communication or possibility, right? To vitalize that in society so that mob-based reactivity and ideological dogmatism and all of that isn't the only option, but that there is somewhere still, and there's obviously other contexts in society that are endeavoring towards doing this. That's why I think it's so important, right? So what are the dynamics of how people fall into populist mob, consumptarian mob type stuff that you can speak to?
So the worldview of the old elite will be the worldview of the masses of the future. That's a good tip to start from. So capitalism is now an underclass phenomenon more than anything else. I'll give you a perfect example of that. As a philosopher and formerly a Marxist, 15 years ago, whatever, I could either go to Burning Man in America or I could go and speak at Occupy Wall Street. I turned down Occupy Wall Street. And it turned out Simon Critchley turned it down for exactly the same reason. We had the same response. The kids who gather to do Occupy Wall Street will be sold a T-shirt by the bankers within 3 days that says, I was there, Occupy Wall Street. And they will buy that T-shirt, take an Instagram picture, and go home to their mothers. They're too naive. They're not revolutionaries. This is just fake. This is inauthentic. This is just copying an idea of a television or a film version of, rebellion in Paris, whatever, in 1968, that was in turn a copy of Paris in 1789 or whatever. I don't care. Most revolutions were staged theatrically anyway. It's the middle class who commit revolutions, not the working classes. So all of that is bullshit. Now, I turned that down and I said that I'm not going to go there and participate in that charade, knowing that the bankers are going to move in within 3 days and sell fucking T-shirts and ice cream to the kids and then make money out of the kids so the kids can go home to their mothers and say, look, I was there. I have an Occupy Wall Street T-shirt. Burning Man, for whatever it is, I'm not naive. I'm not saying the Burning Man is the future, but it points towards the future because participatory culture is different. The weird thing about Burning Man is that it is American communism. And the left never understood that. It is American communism because you go to a place for 8 days and you participate in an event with 80,000 people. You're building a temporary city. You're removing the whole city and you hopefully don't leave a trace when you leave as a communist experiment because nobody makes any money out of Burning Man. There are no Coca-Cola sponsorship signs anywhere, and there still isn't at Burning Man in 2026. And now Burning Man has 250 spin-offs around the world. I'm involved in one of them called the Borderland in Sweden. It's my Christmas every year. End of July, I go to the Borderland. You find me there every year. It's 8 days. It's a sacred place. It's a sacred event. It's amazing. Yeah, it's full of hippies. It's kind of weird. But it points towards the future because it's totally 100% communal and built on trust. And nobody makes any money out of it. The fee I pay every year as a membership fee to the Borderland goes straight into creating works of art. And a small fee that goes to bank for the property that we bought, which is co-owned by the participants, by the way. That is communism. And Slavoj Žižek never went to Burning Man. He completely missed it. That's why it's become completely redundant and idiotic. And I'll call myself an extreme right Marxist just to point this out. That it's better to stay in the dialectical deadlock if you're a Marxist these days. But I'm interested in how far we can stretch the idea of communism because communism is the secular name for the religious congregation. Communism, as we know from Karl Marx, is modeled on Protestant Christianity. And there's a Jewish element thrown in. There's an Exodus myth that we have to go towards a socialist society, then become a communist society, which is a typically Jewish Exodus myth. If you read the Jew in Marx, you find the Exodus myth, the Exodology. And if you read the Protestant in Karl Marx, after all, he grew up in Protestant Germany and loved the factories he built everywhere, then you realize that this guy is thinking post-industrialism and thinking power of the workers, which you should do if you're Karl Marx. But you're rethinking Christianity as we're going to create heaven on earth rather than wait for heaven when we die. Perfectly okay. Communism and Christianity are aligned ideas, but all organized religions, and communism is one of them for good or bad, including, Pol Pot and all those things too, like it includes Islamism and the Crusades and Christianity. They have a bloody past as well. But if you see communism as an organized religion, think of it that way, then the current so-called communists like Slavoj Žižek have completely missed Karl Marx, completely missed the point, have not rethought Karl Marx properly for this day and age. For me, when I wrote the Synthesis book, Creating God in the Internet Age, it's a book both about AI, prophetic. It came out in 2014, but it's more than that. It's more a book about participatory culture and the alignment I see between AI as a tool and participatory culture. Because what I want people to do with AI as a tool is to use it spiritually to define their past, but not ever think the AI can answer the future. If you ask AI for advice on what you're going to do with your future, you're an idiot. Like I tell people, if you can have an AI therapist, congratulations, but you're a very simple creature in that case. Because I can't use AI to advise me on the future. I can only use AI to reconnect with and recollect my past, at best. At best. That's all I can do. So I think we can stay in this space and rethink spirituality as a mission towards the future. Elon Musk has a vulgar version of it, which is put himself in a rocket and go to Mars because he got stuck with Star Trek when he was 6 years old. He's just a boy. We can imagine the future much more artistically than Elon Musk ever could. Let's just leave Elon Musk aside. Yeah, he's a Star Trek boy. He's a boy and he's involved with Star Trek. He even says so. But he's incredibly naive about spirituality. In that case, I would much rather work with his trans daughter, who I think has undressed Elon Musk beautifully. I think the way to get to know Elon Musk is to go through his trans daughter, Vivian, because she's excellent at nailing Elon's own problem. Of course, because she's spiritual. She's shamanoid. She has the shamanoid quality that Elon Musk doesn't have. He's just square. So I'd say spirituality and religion is where this is at. The religion was always the religion of the social. It was always about the congregation. The great thing about Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Zoroastrianism and Taoism and all the world religions is that they always focused on the congregation, the social, the recreation of the social, so that people are comfortable. And capitalism is using this to create gated communities, and the gated communities try to look like socions. When in reality, we should have spiritual communion, we should have spiritual congregations. And we're going to go there. We're going to find that path eventually. We just have to do it with the AI and with digital tools and with digital society as the companions in this kind of work. And this was the whole point with the Synthesis book. It looks erratic first when you look at the book in 2014. It now starts to make perfect sense because our whole idea with the book was to take participatory culture, rethink theology as God is something we're creating. God is not something that created us. We're creating God. And God is the name for the sacred between human beings. And humanity is moving towards creating God, a God for humanity. And that's what we're doing, and we call it sin theology. And therefore we rethink theology, rethink religion, rethink spirituality to address what needs to be addressed once the digital age really hits us hard and everywhere.
Yes, okay. So a few more threads there that definitely need their own conversation. The relation between sort of AI, theology, syntheism, creating God, how the relation between sort of AI and participatory culture. I have a lot of thoughts on all of that and different things I've developed in writing, which, yeah, it definitely wants quite a bit of a dialogue there. I wanted to, as we look towards closing now, I suppose I have to sort of somewhat regrettably put a pin in that. I spoke, so I want to make some connections here just for the sake of creativity, because I did ask the question and you spoke to it a little bit, but I know there's much more to say there in terms of the dynamics of populist mobs that can be manipulated and are sort of.
It was a mob, it was not a swarm. That's the point. The swarm was Burning Man, and the left didn't see it.
Yes.
Yeah. So you got my point, right?
Yes, I certainly get that. The connection I wanted to make could be to do with the role that what you refer to as the shamanoids can play, but then are permitted to play in relationship to how these dynamics show up. Now, of course, loads of shamanoids at Burning Man. In principle, not as many at Occupy. But I also say, when I think of communism and I think of how communism has shown up in its most negative form, I think sort of immediately of killing so many of the shamanoids, right? Whatever that doesn't belong inside the sort of the fixed image of what the congregation should be proper. And so there could be distinctions made with respect to, from the perspective of then how the mob can, how the congregation can show up as mob versus how the congregation can show up as a more generative element in society, which is to say today relate across differences and boundaries so that there are multiple congregations. And for that, of course, you know, speaking to your philosophy, there are go-betweens, and the role of the shamanoid as enabling communication between those congregations. And I like how you speak to the historical analogy of the Silk Route, and then you have sort of temples popping up as the places for the walled cities to then send people to go, and trade happens there and whatever else. And so, there's a tying together of, well, this tribe worshipped this god and this other one worshipped another god, and it turns out, oh, we can say they're brothers, right? And then they belong to the same shared lineage. And so from a syntheology perspective, there's something, I think, aspirational to be said around the knitting together of how human beings across congregations relate to the sacred. And then in the context of how communication shows up today, I'm always very, very wary of when what functions as a shamanic capacity in supporting understanding and communication across difference, real thinking, philosophy as such, really, when that's showing up versus when that's not, it makes for a tremendous difference, obviously, in terms of the depth and attunement that can actually be shared in common with respect to the sacred, with respect to value, right? With respect to relating with the broader issues in the world. And so I think when we pay attention to what influences the energy or the resonance, the quality of experience on the medium, in the medium of communication itself, we really come to a kind of ground zero, a point of real imminent contact regarding what can be, what can commune together today, rather than break apart and fall into this kind of reactivity of mob against mob. And so I think, more people across whatever class you like need to really attend to what mediums, what contexts for communication actually support that, rather than mimic and perform what it is to engage or to platform debate, right? Or some bullshit reactivity against. And so anyway, there's more to be said there, but that's a very important.
Yep. No, it's great. That's why we base our work on the mob on René Girard, who's a master of understanding the mob. He's wrong on many things when it comes to details. Christianity did not invent the opposition to the mob, actually enhanced the mob. But he's right on describing how the mob works. Interjectivity, all these terms you had here are fundamentally Girardian, or have been added to Girard. The mob is fundamentally fundamentalist, dogmatic. It simplifies the world. It kills the innocent. And then when you ask the mob, you just killed the innocent. Well, if you innocents need to die for the good cause. Isn't this exactly what fundamentalists always say? To get the mob together, you destroy truth and simplify everything to a truth. You create a truth which is comfortable and convenient and extremely simplified, because the frustrations of the mob is what you're alerted to. And you want the frustration of the mob to be focused on one point. So therefore, the mob is driven by a lie, and it's driven by the lie that if you only kill him, or if you only kill her, safety and comfortability and everything beautiful will return, and we will get out of our predicament. Because if you only get rid of that person, if only that one thing is done, everything will change. Which is, of course, not what happens. So you kill that one person, the scapegoat, and then you get a temporary calmness, and then the whole frustration returns because you haven't really dealt with the frustration in the first place. So the opposite of fundamentalism is art. Art is, I don't know what to think of this. That's exactly the point. This is fascinating. It's even transformative. Going through this artistic experience, I'm not going to be the same person when I come out of it. That's kind of thrilling, because I've already been that person that I was. I don't have to be that person again. And why shouldn't I become an older, wiser, but more than anything, just different person than the person I was? And therefore, I go through a transformative experience. And that's what real art does to us. And this is why I focus on Burning Man. I focus on participatory culture. I'm thinking the next step. I'm thinking people who live permanently in communities that have the Burning Man ethos with them, but also have the realistic, pragmatic attitude of everyday life that you need as well. Because Burning Man is a dream for 7 or 8 days, and not everybody can afford to go to whatever. But, most people could live a different life if they wanted to. And I think just like time now returns with a vengeance, as time itself, as pure time, as chronomics, the same thing is going to happen with art. I leave to the artist. I work with Owen Cox, for example, who's an amazing British artist and also thinker. I leave that to the artist to do it. I mean, I make music myself. I create participatory culture. I am an artist in a way, and philosophers are artists too, but I see myself primarily as a philosopher here to inspire artists to create great art. That's my job. And in this sense, the artist is the shamanoid. And this is exactly what the shamanoid character, about 4% of people are shamanoid, 96% are not. And LGBT is a different category. Sometimes there's an overlap. There are gay monks and things like that. But the LGBT and the shamanoid are different categories. We talked about this before. But about 4% of people are shamanoid. And they're only there as a reservoir for humanity when paradigm shifts happen. When there's a dramatic change of events and a dramatic change of the human condition, the shamanoids step into the picture. And they respond with art, meaning they're non-dogmatic. They're opposed to dogma because they cannot live in a fixed world, because a fixed world is dead. A fixed world is the past. A fixed world is data. And art goes beyond the data. Art is continuous. Art is not discrete. Fundamentalists are discrete. Fundamentalists today are zeros and ones people. When we talk about the tyranny of the zeros and the ones, when people believe in AI too much, they've gone dogmatic already because they believe in the dogma of AI, because AI cannot produce anything but dogma. It's asked to produce dogma. That's what it does. It's artificial dogmatics. By the way, great term. You take that with us from this conversation. But that's what AI is, artificial dogmatics. And I don't want to be dogmatic. I want to be alive. I want to be open to the future. I want to have different options. I want to play. I want to play around with different alternatives to then construct the future. And once that future has become the past, I accept it. But I will not accept the future while it's still future, because as long as it's future, I have the freedom to affect it and be a part of it and do what I want with it, with my sociant, and appreciate the future for the benefit of my sociant that I participate in. And this is why we should put art against fundamentalism and realize that fundamentalism is the message of the mob. And art is what comes out of the swarm. The swarm is artistic. It's fundamentally, even if collectively, artistic.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Well, we have the opportunity to close here. I'll see if I'll just make one comment about AI. Maybe it opens too much.
Well, why don't we have that conversation later and see where things go?
Yeah, something to return
I'm not
to.
hard convinced to come on your podcast. I love it because we go into these thorough discussions and I get incredible inspiration from these conversations and from our followers that engage in conversations with us. So,
yes, it's very much ongoing, and I think that
all of this is ongoing. It's absolutely ongoing.
That's the only thing. I will just say it because it's just a little point. It doesn't need. It's not something I think that'll be a point of contention between us exactly. Whereas there's more things to go into there in future conversations, and that is, I do see recently a number of mathematical discoveries apparently being made by AI. Now that makes sense to me in a context of ones and zeros and discreteness, right? And symmetry and working with equations. And so that which the human has not computed so far, the AI can surely do. And what that opens up again in terms of emergent complexity is very interesting. So even though in a sense that there's a kind of inert, discrete, past set of data, there's also a sense of how that maybe taps into virtuality that has been yet untapped. I know you might. Okay.
Because mathematics is fundamentally tautological. You have to remember you're talking to a mathematician. Well, it's definitely tautological. You don't invent mathematics; you discover.
Yeah. No, I'm with that.
What AI is doing is AI is discovering. That's all it's doing.
Yes.
And you can call that creative. It's creative to go and explore. I agree.
Yeah.
Creative, but it's exactly what we expected AI to do, and to do even more, to make mathematics even more distinct, even better, even more sharper, even more detailed, and go further in mathematics than human brains have managed to do.
Yes. Yes, I'm holding it that way
That's
too.
goes on. And mathematics, thankfully, mathematics has many pluses and minuses. But mathematics, as we have decided that we constructed, we decided what we have discovered. We made a system out of it. And mathematics, because it included the zero and the infinity sign, included continuity and the dichotomy, the dialectical deadlock between discretion and continuity is therefore within mathematics itself. Mathematics is the mathematics both of the square and of the circle. But they never meet. And I think that's fundamental even to reality. I think physics and subphysics eventually have to depart and go different ways because subphysics is more primordial than physics, and therefore physics is emergent. And I'm making a big bet on physics being emergent with physicists. And more physicists are beginning to enjoy it because then they can do physics for the sake of physics and don't have to think that they're doing metaphysics, which is what they want. So that could be a good thing to start from. But that's an interesting conversation in the future. The mathematics got continuity simply because we introduced the zero and the infinity sign, and therefore we can do the circle within mathematics.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, that's an
The
important
number p
response.
never stops. When you discretize the number p, it never stops.
It never
Because
stops.
continuity can never be discrete.
Yes. Yes. Okay. That's an important response to what I said.
Yeah.
That's
So
that's so.
mathematics has both. So that's exactly why I'm not surprised at all that Stephen Wolfram, for all, I can argue with Stephen a lot and we disagree on many things because he's a Platonist. He's a bit square. But even Stephen Wolfram agrees with me that emergentism is inherent to mathematics itself. And I said, because mathematics then luckily enough reflects reality that much, that emergence as a principle and irreducibility is within mathematics itself. I would bet that the reason why irreducibility and emergence are properties of mathematics as a whole is because mathematics is tautological. But there was a very, very conscious, the only choice in mathematics done in mathematics over the last 3,000 years was the choice that the Indians made first to include the number zero in mathematics because zero is nothing and there is no nothing. So you introduce zero, and then you also introduce the infinity, which is the reflective of the zero. And this is philosophically incredibly interesting in mathematics, that we do have to deal with the zero and with the infinity. And that's
Right.
why people who really think infinity go crazy.
Right. So can I just clarify then? When you were speaking about the past before, I was hearing you reference that in term to understand the past then would it involve both the discrete and the continuous? Because
Yeah.
as soon as
If you
you're
look at the history, if you look at the history of the universe and they decide it's not a physical history, it's a physical and subphysical history, and subphysics and physics are reducible to one another, then suddenly it makes sense that gravity is never unified with quantum mechanics. Because you're talking about two different things. That's been my argument since 2003. We'll see where it goes.
yeah, there's a way in which I was conceiving the latent discoveries to be made by AI in the domain of maths in terms only of the discrete before, but introducing continuity into that is where you're saying some of the emergence comes in. But then I think AI,
The way AI cannot do continuity, therefore AI does approximations. And what you do when you discretize a continuity, that's you're actually leaving the continuity as continuity, and you discretize it by making an approximation of it. Therefore, if you look close enough at a circle on a computer screen, you discover that it has
right,
pixels and not a circle at the very bottom of the whole thing. This is when
right.
you shift analog to digital in itself. You make an approximation of the analog.
But an equation,
Otherwise you couldn't count.
but equations or functions, I don't know the right technical words here, that involve sort of ongoing, sort of ad infinitum numbers would be referenced in maths as the continuous rather than
Yeah.
the discrete.
Yes. In math, they would be. A mathematician would tell the difference, and a computer cannot compute that.
Okay, so that's where there's sort of an
We're
intuition.
moving towards I can even tip you about like Magnus Boman, for example. In Sweden, is working on analog computers. There's also work being done on quantum computers, which is a big hype. I'd say analog computers are even more interesting. There are ways of doing computation without doing the discrete. But the discrete standard for computation is what we mean with computation today, because
Right.
99.99% of all computation is done as this discrete zeros and ones. The binary computers won the day. You can still do computation in analog manners, and the way we're going to construct analog computers and quantum computers is that we're going to have them as a temporary route when they're good for making a smart shortcut when you do computation. And that's how you're not going to have quantum computers per se. You're going to have hybrid computers that have a quantum element. You're going to have hybrid computers that have an analog element. And what you do with the analog, for example, when you make weather predictions or climate predictions, even more so, there's so much data involved that to get a graph out of the data, you need to imitate the analog rather than go for the discrete.
Okay, so if I stay in a playful territory, then is that looks to me like a more of like an end game possibility for transhumanism. There's something involving, if you talk about analog compute, then that opens up an, I think a lot of people thinking,
I don't know if it will work. It's just an
right.
idea. It might just collapse from day one because it's just too simple and it's not applicable to any. I wouldn't know today. And, you can ask me about the future. I expect biocomputers to exist eventually, but no computers that are even remotely biological. And that's exactly why biology is such a great place to be today, to attack the machine and go back to the human. Not only with consciousness, obviously machines are not conscious, human beings are, sometimes at least, and biology, because biology and consciousness is what I want to defend in the new book, because the machines today are doing none of that. None whatsoever.
All right. Well, I'm going to continue to think about mathematical continuity, and if I was to continue this conversation, I'd definitely be interested in hearing you speak to, involving then the concept of mythos, pathos, and logos in relation, because I would wonder if there would need to be a distinction with respect to continuity as expressed in logos, but in this case, there's still being
continuity is pathos. Logos
well, but that's right. And so how can pathos
fundamentally
enter mathematics that AIs are relating with? All of a sudden, that is opening up a domain for artificial intelligence that I have, like, it's difficult. I'm not metabolizing that, right? Like, I'm resisting it. It feels like something is being either reduced or
imitating the emotional by using probabilities.
Well, I get that part.
Probabilities aren't fixed before the probabilities have an outcome. Therefore, it looks like but it's imitating the emotionality that you and I have as human beings. It feels nothing.
That I'm with. That's already locked and loaded. But that's why
It doesn't really do induction. It imitates induction, because we do abduction with our feelings, and so the deduction is what it does beautifully. And then the induction is what it imitates, and abduction it can't do. And because induction is the merger of abduction and deduction, therefore, there's no abduction going on in machines. Therefore, it can only imitate induction. And the way to imitate that is through probabilities, which is a brilliant way of doing it. But therefore, it's just as brilliant as doing approximations when you're working with the continuous. Because if you put the continuous into a computer, it burns down in no time at all.
Right. Well, that's right. But what you're introducing is the possibility of there being some kind of computer that's part biological or whatever, that's engaging in with continuity in a different way.
I'm sure there are startups out there trying to do biocomputing, but it'll all implode because it won't happen in the foreseeable future anyway. Because the idea is thrilling, but it's fiendishly hard to do any of these things, technologically speaking. I mean, we are still working with the steam engine. A computer is fucking steam engine, to be honest.
Okay,
it's just steam engine with data. That's what it is.
Could I put it like this then? Is it the case that for already surfaced, in a sense, even if latent, sort of latent pathways of mathematical exploration that have been yet untapped or uncomputed by the human, AI can provide some sort of resolution to, but in terms of opening up or like through abduction or intuition, making that move to actually really factor the continuous into the mathematical work,
I'd say the other way around. I'd say, imagine a computer without mathematics. Oh, a biological creature.
So is this then a route for you? Do you see like, it would be a distinct kind of artificial intelligence, but in terms of the creation that we are mediating, non-human consciousness through this pathway?
No.
Is that no? I'm trying to, because that's not how I think about this, right? But what I'm trying to incorporate is the role that you're saying, the function of continuity within mathematics itself, which on the one hand AI cannot do, and yet I'm also hearing you say there is a kind of AI that in principle can actually do computations that treat the continuity appropriately. I'm trying to understand what that means for emergent creation, basically.
Well, it's too early to tell. And future human beings would probably define that. The beauty of transcendental emergentism is that the emergentist, the philosopher himself, defines the transcendent boxes, the emergence vectors of such a worldview. That means if a new emergence occurs historically, all of emergence theory has to be rewritten accordingly. Because there is no God and there is no pre-program and there is no design used anywhere. So that's why
study some maths.
Emergentism is my position metaphysically, is that I find all other metaphysical positions simply too naive to be taken seriously. Transcendental emergentism is the only serious alternative metaphysics for me.
Yes, so, well, that conversation I want to have.
We can have this conversation. Let's see what has happened over the next 6 to 12 months. I mean, if it affects our thinking at all, or whether our thinking has been unaffected.
Yeah.
By what, technologically speaking. I still think of computers as steam engines with zeros and ones in them. It's all mechanics. It's all mechanics. Nothing is organic so far about computers. To go into organics, put some plants in a garden or get a fucking baby, and you're back in the organic world again because computers are nothing but mechanics.
That's how I've been thinking about it. But there's something you've opened up there in terms of, to the degree we can say continuity is like really shows up without reduction in the mathematical world.
I've argued for that the term quantum mechanics was unfortunately should be called quantum organics. I'm beginning to doubt that now. Maybe quantum mechanics was the better term after all. You're allowed to play around with words that way. The quantum organics is basically describing quantum mechanics, something that looks much more organic than mechanic to us when we're looking at it. But it could also be the quantum mechanics eventually has to be divided because it doesn't make any sense as one unit of thinking. The way I don't think physics makes any sense as one unit of thinking anymore. It's just that the physics departments, they have billions of dollars to spend on superstring theory and other nonsense, whereas we don't have any subphysics departments that are armed to fight the physics departments. So the problem for something novel like subphysics to think subphysics properly is that I probably eventually have to align with physicists of gravity and the gravity theorists, because it's probably where you're going to find a separate category called subphysics eventually. That's why I'm a fan of Sabine Hossenfelder. She's a determinist. I disagree with her on determinism. But as Einstein's daughter, I agree on her that the big trick is gravity, not quantum mechanics. See where that goes.
Well, I can only offer what popped into my imagination, and it was the phrase, the return of space, as soon as you mentioned gravity there.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And we will return to consciousness, most definitely, because what I love about your work, Tim, is you're really an ardent existentialist.
It's not an unfair characterization. I don't think that's an unfair.
If I move from metaphysics towards consciousness and existentialism in my current work, then this would be a really interesting future discussion for sure.